Allow me to remind you, for those of you who weren't here in the last session, that everybody is invited to the cultural events this evening. The buses will leave from the building, from the street behind us. I will tell you about more details at the end of the session. But right now, we will shortly start with our next session. Entitled Water Crisis, What is the Economically Rational Behavior? The discussion will be moderated by Ms. Maria Donoso, co-director of the international programs of the Institute for Water and Environment of the Florida International University, also member of the International Program and Drafting Committee of the Summit. I would kindly ask the panel participants to come up on stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a great honor for me to be here today, accompanied by the distinguished keynote speakers and panelists in the stage. Allow me to first present to you the structure and dynamics of the session, and indicating, and the title for the session is related to water crises. What is the economically rational behavior? Now, when I received this title, to me it was interesting. It was also intriguing and very provocative. So, we are going to be addressing here questions and concepts that will most likely open a Pandora box, and I hope it does that. The panelists and the keynote speakers had indicated that it will happen. We will be trying to respond a number of questions, such as what is the impact of environmental change on the global finance, especially if we are in a water crisis. Also, we will try to address challenges and new issues such as how does finance trends and changes impact the environment? Or how does the increasing credit markets are affecting consumption and resources use? So this is just to give you an idea of the paradigms that will be brought to your attention. So allow me now to introduce our two keynote speakers. And we have Mr. Martin Frick. He's the Senior Director for Policy for UN Climate Change. We have also the next, I'm going to introduce them all so that we don't have to stop with the introductions. We also have Mrs. Jennifer Sara. She is the Global Director for Water Global Practices at the World Bank. Next to her, we have His Excellency Minister Simon Sachs. He is the Minister of Environment and Special Planning of Slovenia. Next to His Excellency is Mrs. Monica Weber-Farr, Executive Chairperson of the Global Water Partnership, and she is the Director of the organization. In the next order, we have Mr. Joseph Sia Agepon, who is Executive Chairman for the Jaspong Group. Our next panelist is Mr. Karyan Queen, Director of the Middle East Desalination Research Center, and he will be talking about the Middle East initiatives. And last but not least, Ms. Karine Mason, Head of Water Management Division of the European Investment Bank. So these are our distinguished panelists and keynote speaker for this session. I kindly ask that in order to keep up with the time, that we do not applaud after each presentation, and that way we can really have a dynamic session. So with this, I would like to leave this speech to Mr. Martin Frick, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. This is working. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending here, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak here about climate change and the climate change process. Following what I have heard today, I would like to talk about two things, about complexity and about radical cooperation. Now, complexity, climate change is certainly the most interdependent problem mankind has ever faced. And there is a reason why we take forever in the international arena to actually speak about these issues. Mind you, 1992, there was the Earth Summit in Rio, and we negotiated at the time 4 instruments: the United Nations Environmental Programme, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and the convention I'm working for, which is the Climate Change Convention. It took 25 years of negotiations to be at the stage where we are now. And if we go back in time a little bit, 2009, some of you might remember the Copenhagen Climate Conference and how with a loud bang all of the diplomatic process went against the wall. Well, this was almost the end of the climate negotiations, but it came back and culminated then in the end in the Paris Agreement, which is now our polar star in the sky of the climate negotiations. What has happened? What has happened was that since the Kyoto Protocol, so since the Conference of the Parties 1997, all of the state parties have pursued an approach that is top-down, that there would be an international instrument ratified by sovereign states, and then it becomes legislation, and all of the national entities have to follow that. This approach ended in Copenhagen, and the Paris Agreement actually does the opposite. The Paris Agreement invites parties on a voluntary basis and on the basis of their sovereignty to define what measures they want to take to fight climate change on 2 respects. One, in a global perspective, to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade. And with IPCC 1.5, we know that actually we are talking about 1.5 degrees. And the second bit is to build the resilience in the societies that you need to survive the climate that is already changing. Now, this is an extremely complicated process, and even prior to the Paris Agreement, there was more and more recognition that this is actually bigger than what you can do on the basis of normal, standard international public law, talking to diplomats and representatives and ministers only. So there is an increasing action agenda in which non-state actors, which is our UN English for everybody who is in this room, with very few exceptions, I don't know whether we have ambassadors here, but that everybody from the real life needs to be a part of this process. And fast forward, September this year, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, had all of these non-state actors also invited to be in New York to contribute. So, if we have a problem in which basically everything we do emits CO2 today, and everything we can do to absorb CO2, both is imminently global, and it takes 7.6 billion people to solve it, how on earth can we manage this complexity? And I heard earlier in the session, water is a perfect entry point to understand the complexity of the modern society. Well, CO2 is another one of these aspects. But second part, let me come to the point where water is coming in. This conference has been instrumental to put water on the agenda. And like so many things, it took years in the climate process to have the process evolving from a conference of ministers of environment to the recognition that most of our emissions actually come from energy production, to the recognition that forests play a major role, and with that the circle in which we are operating becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, how to manage this complexity? And that brings me to the second part. I said that the Paris Agreement is built on the voluntary contributions of sovereign nation states, the so-called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Now, these NDCs require something that our former executive secretary, Christiana Figueres, has called radical cooperation. Because it's not only something that is bigger than any one portfolio of any one ministry or minister in a government, it truly needs an all-of-society approach. And water is fundamental to that. If these climate plans are to fulfill their true function of guiding the implementation of the Paris Agreement and at the same time being the piece where the rubber hits the road on the realization on the Sustainable Development Goals, then of course water and all other sectors have to be a part of that. Now, third and last part, where does finance come in? And finance is the title of this session. What would economically make sense? Well, economically, it would have made a lot of sense to already start in the early 90s to aggressively fade out the burning of fossil fuels, to work on carbon sinks, reforestation, peatlands, and what have you, and restore the planet. The opposite has happened, and many of the things that we had predicted in the climate science world to happen in 2040 or 2050 are happening already right now. So this train has left the station. But what does make sense in a financial way is to really go and talk to the experts of all different fields, have water policies integrated in infrastructure plan, in global climate plans, in the SDG fulfillment. And I think it would also make sense to have these considerations from a financial standpoint. Because if you look at the financial markets of this world, they are boasting with liquidity, and there is so much money out there that basically if you try to place 5,000 euros or whatever amount with your bank, they don't even give you interest for that. So I think on the other side, on the financial side, we have a vital interest to put that money into use before the bubble actually bursts. And last sentence, this is a historic opportunity, I believe, to build all of the infrastructure that we need for the 21st century, very much like in the Victorian times, the infrastructure of all our beautiful cities, particularly here in Europe, was built, and it's still lasting 100 years later. This is a fantastic opportunity, and this is also something where we can really create what was the slogan of the Rio conference 20 years on, the future we want. Thank you very much.
We will now give the floor to our colleague Jennifer from the World Bank.
Thank you. And I have a slide presentation. Okay, it's gone up. So good afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And as Maria said in the introduction, we really want to thank the conference organizers for coming up with such a provocative title for this session. What is the economically rational behavior to confront our water crisis? Well, at the World Bank, we have a lot of economists, and so my team and I enjoyed pondering this question, and honestly, we were not quite sure how we were going to answer this question. And soon we realized that, in fact, the reason we are experiencing such a water crisis is exactly because of the extremely irrational way that we set policies, we make investment choices, and we manage water at the local level and the global level. So we thought that one way to try to answer this question is to take us through a quick journey of the economic water cycle. And next. Oh, did I go too far? Sorry. Which one? I'll figure this out. 1 second. Okay, so as was mentioned earlier this morning, very eloquently by our host, the Honorable President Adair of Hungary, as well as by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, we recognize that our world of water is in crisis. Our new global norm is that we either have too much, too little, or water that is too polluted. 90% of natural disasters are water-related, as the Secretary General told us this morning, and we expect floods to become more frequent and more severe. Water pollution is also increasing. 80% of our wastewater is untreated, and runoff from farms has severe impacts on our health and on our planet. We recently released our report called Quality Unknown, which determined globally that poor water quality can reduce economic growth by up to a third. And while floods catch the headlines, droughts have economic costs 4 times greater than that of floods. 4 billion people in the world today currently live in regions that experience severe water stress. And while water is in crisis, at the same time, we know that water touches every aspect of development and is fundamental to life itself. We need water to deliver all of the SDGs for people, for the planet, for production. Water is a vital factor of production. Economic growth is a very thirsty business. And of course, water and sanitation are critical to improving human capital outcomes. So, let us start our journey through the economic water cycle to help understand how we've gotten ourselves into this water crisis. First of all, why is water so complex and distinctive to manage? It's because the mobility of water and the opportunity for sequential use and reuse make water different than most other commodities. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. And at different times, as water flows through the water cycle, water can be a public good or a private good, or it can be a public bad, as one person's waste becomes the next person's degraded resource. So, starting at the source, thank you, at the source in a watershed, where springs push their way through the rocks, glaciers melt, and rivers begin to flow, water is a public good running freely through nature. But very quickly, the open access nature of the water resource makes it susceptible to the tragedy of the commons, where individuals use the water without concern for its sustainability. And the result we see is deforestation and land use changes impacting watershed and sediment flows, major river diversions that dramatically reduce water flow, overexploitation of groundwater aquifers, and uncontrolled pollution. But we also see solutions to avoid resource depletion and degradation. This can be through regulations, or these can come in the form of economic instruments like tradable permits or payment for ecosystem services. And there are abundant examples of this, and there's a few up here on the slide. For example, New York City pays upstream farmers in the Hudson Valley to adopt environmentally friendly farming techniques, and the city gets to spend less money on water treatment. Similarly, the Beijing government pays farmers upstream of the Miyun Reservoir to convert land from rice cultivation to dry land crops, with the dual goals of increasing water yield in the catchment and reducing nutrient flows into the reservoir. This is clearly a win-win situation for all. So recently, at the policy level, the Peruvian government, through the water and sanitation sector regulator, SUNAS, has incorporated payment for environmental services into the tariff structure. As such, water tariffs become a source of revenue to pay to protect and improve watersheds throughout the country. This seems to be a rational policy. Okay. I just want to make sure, okay. So, as the water runs through the watershed, competing demands for water continue to grow, and it needs to be allocated. The High-Level Panel on Water in 2017 developed a set of principles for valuing water. And these state that allocating water across competing uses needs to be done in a way that is transparent, equitable, and responsive to multiple values placed on water by different stakeholders: economic values, societal needs, and environmental benefits. Allocating water requires more than just setting regulations, though. We need to know who gets how much water, about how much water should be left in the river, and what stays underground. It often requires large-scale investments in infrastructure that can transport and treat the water before it can be distributed for use. And at the same time, as water is taken out of the watershed, other investments need to be made to sustain the public watershed for environmental and social purposes, while also ensuring the capacity of the watershed to serve the other critical functions of buffering against the risks of water extremes, through investments in public policies for flow regulation, for river training and navigation, retention to store water, and wetlands to absorb floods. Water becomes a private good when it gives users exclusive rights to use. For example, when water reaches a tap, it is a private good since the use of water by one precludes its use by others. So as we can see in the yellow circle, most of the uses, almost all the uses, private uses of water are for farms, irrigation, for firms and industry, and for families. Again, investment in infrastructure institutions for managing and delivering the private uses of water, sanitation, irrigation services are also required, and these investments can be private or public. So let's move to the farm. Water on the farm. We know farmers use a lot of water. They irrigate crops, and that accounts for almost 80% of total water withdrawals globally. Providing this huge amount of water over long distances can be costly. But in order for the service to be sustainable, it is important that the costs of sustaining the resource and deliver the water are recovered, ideally through tariffs paid by the farmers. At the same time, field runoff from farms remains one of the leading causes of water quality impairment by nutrient loads and organic pollutants. When water is made available for free or well below its value, it is overused and abused. And to add insult to injury, enormous subsidies on fertilizers also contribute to their overuse and consequential pollution on the watersheds. From an economic policy point of view, however, a rational approach to water tariff setting would be to set tariffs at levels which signal scarcity to avoid the paradox of supply, where cheap water provision leads to overuse, which then leads to water scarcity. And so let me give you a few examples of this. What happens with the paradox of supply is when farmers become dependent on access to free water. And so they grow thirstier crops. And then they are devastated when shortages or droughts occur. Maladaptation occurs everywhere, in countries rich and poor, in both large and small irrigation schemes. In California, poor water management leads to thirsty crops like cashews and almonds being grown in the desert. In the Sahel, increased digging of deep wells in the desert has led to conflicts between pastoralists and farmers, and has even caused thousands of deaths. Pastoralists, as they expand their herd because there's water available, are both victims and actors in these conflicts. In India, as in other places, small-scale solar pumps or heavily subsidized energy tariffs makes the marginal cost of pumping groundwater very low or free. And this is leading to rapid groundwater depletion and the wasting of a very scarce and precious resource. Even when governments take good action, as in Turpan Prefecture in China, they had realized that the rapid expansion of irrigation land had greatly increased pressure on groundwater, and it was threatening the viability of agriculture itself, which accounts for 70% of the employment in the region. So the government responded by incentivizing farmers to use modern water-saving irrigation technologies, drip irrigation, sprinklers, canal lining. But however, just like other places, and many other places, the expected water savings were not realized, because as farmers started to having more water available, they just expanded their production, the total area of cultivated farmland. So in this basin, instead of saving water, the groundwater levels continue to decline by 1.5 to 2 meters per year. And most of this is happening because farmers use and abuse water that is undervalued. Okay, so let's move into the city. The next use of private water and sanitation services for domestic use in the city and also in rural areas. While municipal water supply uses much less water as a resource, the costs of service provision are much higher due to the need to have high-quality treated water, a distribution system, and a collection system for the wastewater. Now, ideally, water utilities in cities at least, should be able to recover, at the very least, operating costs through the use of tariffs. However, shockingly, worldwide, less than 20% of water utilities around the world can cover operating costs based on tariffs alone. making it very difficult for them to expand networks and attract private financing. And even worse, upwards of 50%, and I think someone this morning said it was 80% of water in cities is non-revenue, meaning it is either lost to leaky pipes, or it is accessed informally, or just unaccounted for. This does not seem to be economically rational at all. But there are ways to design tariffs to allow for cost recovery while also ensuring access to water for all, recognizing the water as a human right. Therefore, sufficient quantities need to be made available at affordable prices. But free water is often most expensive for the poor, who do not have piped access and must buy water from vendors. On average, piped water is 10 times cheaper than water from vendors. In fact, according to our recent report on water subsidies, getting more from less, governments spend $320 billion per year on subsidies for water. 56% of these subsidies are captured by the wealthiest 20% of the population, while a mere 6% are used by the poorest 20%. Again, this does not seem economically rational policy. And finally, the last private use of water I want to talk about is in industry. And industry actually recognizes the value of water that it uses, and most importantly, the risks of not having it, as noted year after year by the World Economic Forum. And we actually have quite a lot to learn from industry on how it uses water, since it's such a vital input for production, and many industries are successfully reducing their water use footprint, particularly in water-scarce regions, and reducing untreated effluents. But importantly, water savings in industries not only have to consider the factories and supply chains, which most companies measure and are very proud to share their findings, but also the footprint on the wider watershed in which they operate, where the water is a public good. There are ways of finding these solutions. The World Bank's 2030 Water Resource Group and other actors and partners try to form multi-stakeholder platforms to bring together the large water users, the public sector, the private sector, civil society, to improve water governance, to increase incentives for water efficiency, and to promote a circular economy for water, and also, importantly, innovation. Okay, so let's go back to the river. We've taken all the private uses for water, and water, when it returns to the source, it closes the economic water cycle loop, and the water is a public good once again. But if it's polluted and not properly treated, it imposes a cost on the next user and can cause harm to the environment, people, and the economy. Therefore, wastewater from cities is a public bad, which imposes harms and costs on others, and water treatment is needed to turn this bad back into a good. From an economically rational point of view, people are generally willing to pay to have wastewater removed from their house, maybe from their street. But once beyond the boundaries of their property and their street, they tend to care little what happens. And this is a clear market failure with huge environmental, economic, and health externalities. And unfortunately, the polluter pays principle is a great principle, but it's often not enforced, and governments have a role not only to regulate, but also to use economic instruments to incentivize the enforcement of regulations. We know that investments in water treatment can be incentivized through a lot of instruments like pollution taxes, permits, command and control approaches, but also, given the very high costs, public financing subsidies are needed to collect and treat wastewater. At the same time, we need an innovation to reduce costs, increase operational efficiency of treatment plants, and promote decentralized options for off-grid options, for example, for treating fecal sludge management. But the good news for rational economists is that adopting a circular economy approach to water and sanitation is the best way for us to improve the economic and financial sustainability of our investments while sustaining the resource. There's increasing recognition that wastewater treatment processes can produce a number of spillover benefits in terms of generating renewable energy while mitigating GHG emissions, by recovering nutrients from wastewater for agriculture. And treated water can be reclaimed, used for recharging aquifers, or even reused for drinking, thereby reducing the need for additional withdrawals. And there are many examples of these approaches, from markets in Senegal for fecal sludge management, to Maharashtra in India, which has set up an innovative wastewater trading system to ensure water pollution levels remain below targets, and it's built on blockchain. And we used a hackathon to crowd in ideas on how it could be designed. It's built on a blockchain which ensures that transparency, easy verification, and a tamper-proof design. Then we have examples also in Tenorio, Mexico, where the sale of treated wastewater completely covers the operation and maintenance costs of water treatment. Power plants use treated wastewater for cooling towers, which is 33% cheaper for waste than groundwater. So the list goes on, and this makes a lot of economic sense, and it's great for the environment. So let's move from crisis to solutions. At the World Bank, we're working, like many, many of you in the world now, I think, is on a vision for a water-secure world for all, which builds on economics and, once in a while, some engineering, to bring solutions across the three interrelated pillars. Sustaining our water resources, not just managing, but sustaining our water resources, delivering services for all the SDGs, and building resilience. Resilience to climate change, resilience to fragility, resilience to other shocks. Our approach takes into account the public and private nature of water. We try to frame solutions that respond to rational economic behavior, both at the policy level and the individual level. And we're guided by the 3 I's: investment, information, and institutions. Investment that is efficient makes judicious use of public money to provide subsidies where needed for public goods and for the poor, and leverages concessional finance to attract commercial funds. In terms of information, we can only manage water if we have data on water quantity and water quality. Data helps provide the evidence to policymakers about the cost of the water crisis. This is so, so important. How do we get the ministers of finance and the presidents of countries to really understand there is a water crisis and to move into a call for action? And open source data is a powerful way to name and shame, or hopefully name and reward, and raise awareness for social accountability. And now that we have the 4th industrial revolution technology, it offers a huge promise. There are so many ways now for the remote sensing, blockchain, Internet of Things for water allocation. We really need to make use of all these. So last but not least, we need to support and strengthen sustainable institutions with the right policies, incentives, and regulations to manage across the water cycle. So we look forward to come together as a community to galvanize around delivering all water-related SDGs as we respond to the urgency of climate change. And let me end, this is my very last slide, and I wanted to ask, if you read this slide, do we have an economically rational behavior when the estimated annual economic losses due to water mismanagement costs $94 billion to food producers and consumers and to us, from droughts and water scarcity that we haven't prepared for, $120 billion in property damage from floods, $260 billion from inadequate water and sanitation, and that's only a partial list. So it was a great question, and I hope I provided some provocative answers or semi-answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frick and Jennifer, for our excellent presentations and for starting to create that atmosphere of incognitos that we would like to address. And let me start first with Karen. Karen, IAV is very sophisticated and in terms of financial tools and whatnot. And recently there was a statement made by your institution indicating that the lack of comprehension and knowledge of financial principles and finances and trend could be deteriorating or could be counterproductive in addressing financial opportunities for the water sector. Can you explain a little bit about this, and what are you doing to kind of counteract that? What are you launching recently in that regard?
Okay, thank you, Maria. Maybe first a few words on who we are, European Investment Bank. So we are a public finance institution owned by the 28 member states of the EU. And our goal is to provide long-term sustainable financing, so particular to water projects where we finance around 3 to 4 billion a year, both in the private and public sector. So we really have a big challenge that has been announced here. We need to act quickly. And in the EIB, we do this by supporting both the public sector and the private sector. And our objective is to finance more investments. Jennifer mentioned one of the 3 I's. There's a huge need for investments, and our president in New York City announced that we would increase our financing for climate and for environment sustainability to 50% of our investments. So there's a lot more that we can do. And this we can do both in the public sector, in the private sector. Coming to your question on the private sector, innovation is really a key part of it. Jennifer mentioned all these new areas where we have to invest more. And we developed a full set of financial products to address this. Innofin in the EU is one of them. And this enables us to finance corporate sector with R&D loans. And we're also able to provide equity to investment funds, for example, for industrial water management. And in our view, this is a really important part of financing that we can provide to support both the public and the private sector. Another clear part, and it's linked to what Martin says, is climate resilience. Obviously, it's not enough to finance more projects. We have to make sure they are resilient. And we set up this internal tool in the EIB to assess the climate resilience of our projects. So this is in addition to the thorough due diligence that our sector experts are doing on every project. But I think this is very critical to ensure that whatever we finance will be resilient and able to resist in the likelihood of extreme weather events.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carrie. Talking with some of our colleagues here in relation to the innovation that has happened in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years in terms of technology, we can see that there are now technologies addressing a myriad of problems that are constantly brought to the table, re-brought to the table, continue to be discussed. So the question is it the finance, is it the economic factor that is impeding to actually make use of those innovative methodologies, techniques that are out there, that is brought by the private sector, the development, research and development sector, or the academic research sector? Desalination is one of those. I mean, we've seen how the countries in the Middle East that have the resources are definitely introducing and using them, and they are solving their water problem. But then you go to a small island in the Pacific or the Caribbean that could also use the technology and is prohibited. What is your institute bringing to the table, or when you are in the process of creating an awareness of this technique, are you partnering with the bank, saying we don't just need to do the technical part, but what about the finance? How can we make this more available to those who need it? Kaigaram, please.
Okay, well, thank you. We don't partner with the bank, and I'll tell you why. Because we do our work through a system of gap analyses with countries. We're a multilateral international organization. The last standing part of the multilateral peace process in the Middle East since the mid-1990s. So we're a very quiet organization, but we do a gap analysis with governments every year on the technology, on the politics, on the negotiations around water, around climate change in the area. And what we find is, I mean, in terms of the technology, I don't say it's settled, but it almost is. It's very advanced. We have a technology called reverse osmosis. The difference between the cheapest reverse osmosis plant on Earth and the 20th cheapest plant on Earth is probably not technology. It's probably the cost of capital. It's probably the externalities they put into the cost. It's probably the person calculating the net present value, what they put into the spreadsheet. It's not really the technology. We have the technology. It's done. So that's fine, and that works. It's perfectly rational to use that. And around that, we have a load of really useful, rational responses now to water. So we've got desalination at the top, but very expensive. You would desalinate brackish water or wastewater before that. It's much, much cheaper, much more effective, much better for the environment to do that. Below that, you have non-revenue water, how to use that. You have how to use water better. Pricing, a humanitarian minimum, and then prices increasing as people use. So you have a lot of that. So there is a pathway, and depending on how much money you have and how you get on with donors and the bank, you can do that. But the real issue that's always missing in this debate and in this dialogue that we find, because we are owned by governments and worked by governments, is state and civil service capacity. That's the operating system for a state to do anything. It's the absolute core operating system. And if that doesn't work, or if that is suboptimal, you can't actually do any of this, okay? And that's actually more and more and more what we focus on. So we will do technical training, we will do research in minimising the environmental impact, boosting, normalising renewables, training and all of that. But it's actually, can your state system understand pricing? Can I negotiate with you with pricing? Can I ensure that a diplomat understands what a hydrologist understands? Because when a hydrologist negotiates with a diplomat, it's like someone with a fork negotiating with someone with a tank. They will lose every single time. A diplomat will always lose. So you have to normalise this. And in terms of our colleagues in Palestine and in Israel, it's actually diplomatic systems, diplomatic negotiations. So the technology is quite easy. It's development and it's peace that you actually need. And in terms then of absolute crisis, where you have an absolute crisis, we have one or two sort of important initiatives. One is what we call the Oman Humanitarian Desalination Challenge. It's a $700,000 prize for the first team anywhere on Earth to develop a small handheld $20 unit which can desalinate seawater, 35,000 parts per million, which can be brought around the world. We think the technology is there. There's 5 or 6 technologies that are almost there, and if they hit each other, we have an absolute humanitarian game changer. These are things that could be pre-positioned in places like Brindisi and deployed. But the key thing is, if you get that technology, you can expand it to village level and beyond very, 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 very easily.
Thank you. Talking about crises, we just had in our neck of the wood in the Western Hemisphere a major situation in the Bahamas with the passage of the latest hurricane, which basically left on the water a number of islands, in some cases with over 10 feet of water. And the community around the area was very, very quick to respond. And within less than 24 hours, we have almost 3 major carriers full of water bottles. The next day, we got a call from one of our colleagues in the Water and Sewage Authority of the Bahamas saying, we need water, but we cannot afford to get more plastic bottles. Because it's already, and that was less than 48 hours after the storm, already is creating a problem. So, you know, we have the crises that are like immediate crises, but we have these long-term crises that are there, and they're permanent and they're constant. And we have to react to both the emergency situation and the constant crisis, which was part of what was referring earlier today by the Honorable President of Hungary. You know, we are in a crisis. We don't need to have a major disaster. So, Joseph, you work with various stakeholders of different level, and you try to also bring them awareness, also see what are they bringing to the table in terms of the activities that they're doing. So how do you address these issues? The permanent crisis, I will say, and then the immediate crisis. And what is the feedback you're getting from those that you are interacting with?
Thank you very much. We want to thank the presenters. Very good presentation about this issue. Water and wastewater. I will try to define it in the private sector mindset that it is always the last thing that we think about. So wastewater will come in when you have used all the water. You don't think about where the waste goes until you have a smell or you have a challenge before you start thinking about it. When water is scarce, before policymakers start thinking about it. So they have been always the last issue of discussions or in terms of policy. And that is why the presentations that we just heard is calling for very serious attention. Our generation in this 21st century, what I think we must do is that we have a system or a responsibility to plan for our situation now and the future. And leaders, there's a quote saying that leaders think and talks about solutions. whereas followers thinks and talks about problems. It is our time to think about solutions. When we are talking, we're talking about solutions. From the morning, we've just heard about that water is a resource. When something is a resource, you bring all your energy to protect it, develop it. Whether it is economical, rational or not, you have to work out it. And I'm in the private sector, working in the waste management and the environmental sector for more than 15 years. Financing in the environmental sector is very, very risky. When you go to banks, because it's a long-term financing, banks don't want to. Banks want quick financing where they can mitigate risks. So when you want to finance into water or into wastewater, that takes about 15, 20 years. Their first touch is looking for a sovereign guarantee from government instrument. Without that, it becomes a challenge. So on the question, what I would say is that we leaders must look at innovative ways of bringing these issues to a solution. And in Ghana, I can give an example that from 1983 to 2008, we were facing a difficult situation in water problem. I have been a victim of water crisis. And I even was infected with a leptospirosis sickness, whereby I took a river water. I walk about 30 kilometers to go and fetch water. And you go, the same water, you have animals and you're taking the same water with you. And all is because financing structure, difficult in private sector get into it. Until 2009, when government opened up for private sector to come in, and the bottled water was came in, the sachet water also came in, other innovations also came in. I'm trying to make the stress point that whether it is economically rational or what or not, water can never be substituted. You can't substitute anything with water. You can't substitute anything with water. When you want to eat, you want to bath, you want to sleep, you want to move, there's nothing that you can substitute with water. So whatever be the case, whether it's stakeholders engagement, education, whatever be the cause of it, we must make sure that we can navigate it through any form of innovation. Let private sectors comes in, open it up, look at the pricing. If government is paying and it doesn't make a return, can it factor it into other use? Because the child needs the water, the baby needs the water, and everybody needs the water.
Thank you. Now, talking about, bringing an integral perspective on water and integrating water into everything. I mean, if we talk about an organization internationally that has pushed the concept of integrated water resources management, we have to talk about GWP here present. But lately, looking through what you're doing in the last couple of years, I see that you're getting into new areas that are very interesting. And we came across these solicitation of proposals for studies on index-based flood insurances. Now, this is interesting because it relates the concept of finance, it relates the concept of crisis, and at the same time, we're dealing with something that is as ancient as history, influence of floods and how this is part of a process, not just when it happens, but it's part of the whole concept of integrated water resources management. Now, how is this going? And because the community that you've been reaching is more like the water management and so on, and suddenly here we go, we're going into full finance and from the perspective of insurance, which is still even more complicated. What made you go in that direction? Was it a need or an interest?
So I think the question you're asking, what on earth are you guys doing with insurance?
Certainly.
It's an important question, but it does have an obvious answer if we think about what the topic of this panel is. And I'm absolutely with Martin and Jennifer, this is an ingenious title. What is the economic rational behavior in relation to border security? And it is, if we think about how we act today, I think one of the things that came very clear also from what Jennifer said, it's the short-term view that drives economically, rationally acting people to cause water insecurity, to cause water crisis, as opposed to address it or defend it or protect the resource. It's economically rational in a world that looks at short-term structures. In the Global Water Partnership, many of you will know us. We are an action network of over 3,000 organizations. We work in over 180 countries, and we look at ourselves as kind of the people that are in between everybody else, that try to bring folks from different stakeholder perspectives together and say, okay, let's figure out what the solution is to the missing policies, the not fully functional institutions, to the management tools that are missing, and the investments and all of those. So as we were doing this over the last few years, we're discovering and seeing that mobilizing many, many more parts of the system that make us behave the way we behave is really needed. So our new strategy going forward is a strategy around mobilization. And the financial sector, and specifically insurance, is a really important one. We work a lot with not just integrated water resource management, but also with integrated flood management, with integrated drought management. And when you look at drought management, it's fascinating. Jennifer had some of those numbers. In fact, it's not just 3 or 4 times more costly. If you look at people affected, fascinating that over 10 to 20 times more of people get affected by droughts than by floods, and yet the money that's moving in there is not only much less, but also doesn't get applied when needed. And I mean, I find it always easy to explain to my children, right? It's very hard to go and buy a very thick winter jacket when it's 30 degrees outside. And so when we were starting to work in the Slovak Republic with the government there several years back on a drought management plan. Now, it was actually, they were in the situation of floods. So how do you do this? How do you make that economic argument? And so we've done over the last couple of years, we've started 4 things. One is we've actually worked with the WMO, the World Meteorological Institute, and more recently with the World Bank on something that became a publication that we launched in March, which is around how to build the economic argument for drought management. And when you look at that set of very interesting checklists and framework ideas, you see that some of that is about pricing and a lot of that is around awareness and which other people to bring in to figure out where are the co-benefits for other actors. And that gets me to the second point, is we did a study a year ago around how to bring in the insurance sector into this work. And there's a lot of co-benefits on the insurance sector, but what you see, and we saw that in the work in the Slovak Republic, but also across Europe, is where the farmer knows they will be compensated, they don't invest in prevention. And similarly, you can get the insurance industry, we all know that some of us buy health insurance cheaper because we don't smoke. Similarly, you can make investment as an individual into prevention infrastructure and then buy for lesser premiums. There's very, very few insurances on the agricultural side that actually take that into account today, which is why we've launched that call for index-based insurances, different insurance experiences. The third one is we've worked with the UN's help consultation on investment principles for water-related disaster risk reduction. And when you look at that, you also discover that the lens that's been taken at the moment is very, very slim on just the economics of things. There's very little engagement with affected communities, with affected farmers, with various affected groups who could, with their behavioral change, contribute to lowering the cost and advancing investments over time. The last one is, and I think they're making the link to the previous panel on valuing water is also very important, is I think that as a community of actors, and I'm just saying now, all of us who work on governance of water, we now look at how can valuing water change decision-making and get better allocation decisions. It's not just about the allocation decisions for water, it's also about wise water management and investment in the bad times, when the times go wrong. So that we have to deal with managing much more cyclical situations so that we get our investments into insurance there. So I think, going back to your original question, what the F is the GWP team doing on insurance? for us, it is one slice of the bigger cake that relates to creating more rational behavior if we would think about the water as being a value, as a valued good that needs to be preserved. And for that, we need to shift how all of us behave. And the insurance sector, the financial sector has a really big part to play in not just, making that a business, but also changing all of our behaviors. So if we can make that conversation about behavior change, I think that's where we're going to get somewhere.
Thank you, Monica. And now we come to Simon. So it has been said a number of times at this stage that, we just cannot bring the environment minister or the water minister, that we need to bring to the discussion the finance minister. How are you doing in Slovenia? Is there a rational behavior within the context of the ministers? Are there good examples, challenges in terms of how to, bring together the finance and also the aspects of environment, water, etc.?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And firstly, thank you to the Hungarian government for organizing this very important panel here in Budapest. Slovenia is a small country, a neighboring country from Hungary. We are rich with water, currently rich with water. And although we are rich, or maybe because of that, water for us is really important. It's so important that we decided in 2016 that we're going to change our constitution. And so we put the right to drinking water into our constitution. And also we said that all water resources are public good that should be primarily used for citizens and households. And this is, because of that, for me, it's easier to talk to our finance minister, because we know that water for our country is the most important thing. Good. It's not easy all the time, but it does help. And when we talk about what is economically good when we talk about water crisis. As I said, we are a rich country regarding water. And when we talk about crisis, we talk about flooding. Floods in Slovenia are becoming more and more often, as in Hungary, as in Slovakia, and in this part of Europe. Although we are getting more and more heat waves as well, and we as well are thinking about droughts. So we're really similar to Slovakia, not only by name. But a good thing that we have done in the Sava River basin is that we have created a very unique flood forecasting system. And what is special about this system is that this system is being used by 4 countries that used to be in war with each other. So it can be done if you want it to be done. And the result of this system is that now the damages caused by the floods are up to 30% less than they used to be. Because if you can if you have a good system of predicting the floods, you can prepare. The governments can prepare, and because of that, the damages are not as big as they would be. And I think that is a really good example, and I do encourage other countries to take a look at this system and duplicate it. It's a good system and it works.
Good, thank you. Well, we discussed a number of issues related to the interrelation between finance and the water sector and the advances of technologies and knowledge in terms of managing water and managing the water crisis. Now, there's a question that we have been talking about within the group back and forth, and that is, okay, there is a lot of information, there's studies going on, discussions going on in terms of how the changes in the environment, the crisis of water, influences in some way the financial sector, and how in designing a loan or applying for a loan, one has to consider environmental risk, climatic risk into it. But the question is also the other way. What and how does the financial system or the decisions made within the context of the financial institutions, whether they are your small bank in your neighborhood, major banks like the ones we have represented here, the World Bank, the inter-regional banks, how are these decisions that are made within the context of the financial system, most of the time in closed doors, are affecting the environment or the water resources, the increasing availability of credits by different financial institutions? Is this provoking an increase in development or in infrastructure, or in a way that if the money is there and it's accessible, well, let's build, quote unquote, is it sustainable or not? So, questions to all the panelists. How does, if it does, from your perspective, from your experience, what is happening inside the financial system and the financial trends that we see in the last years, influencing positively or negative or neutrally the environment, and in particular water resources? Who do we want to start with? Should we start with one of our panelists? Go ahead, Frick.
I would say my experience is more with developing banks, and in my little introduction I spoke about the complexity of issues, and in a previous life I was the climate change director of FAO, of the Food and Agriculture Organization. And when we are looking into, for example, a mountain agroforestry system, then this is a fantastic thing to preserve water resources because it keeps the water. It's also disaster risk reduction because it prevents landslides. Odds are that it's a project that empowers women, food security. Anyway, it's a fantastic project. But what's happening is you go to different development banks or development agencies to have it financed. And if you say it's a gender project, then you say, well, bring me a climate change project. Well, yes, it's also a climate change project. Yes, but it has a strong disaster risk reduction aspect. And so you go around with a project that actually ticks so many boxes to find out that doesn't help you to get money, but it makes it actually more complicated. And, you know, if we call for holistic management of water systems, I could envisage that we are up against the same struggle of our project proposals not being specific enough, while exactly they need this holistic view.
Go ahead.
No, thank you. I think, well, actually, I'm not sure our decisions are made behind closed doors because we're also a public sector institution on financing. But it's interesting because the private sector always says we have so much money, but we can't find projects to invest. It's always perplexing to me. And we interface a lot with governments. And for governments, we try to also get them invest into a much more holistic approach to water, to large-scale programs, to look at what I was showing, the whole watershed, the water cycle. But the way many projects and programs are, they get sliced up. And so for a long time, governments would borrow because they wanted to fix the pipes, and then we were encouraging them, why didn't you fix the institutions that fix the pipes? And now we're saying, well, let's make sure there's water to go into the pipes, and then let's also make sure we treat the water that comes out of the pipes. So the story does get bigger, and it gets changes, but it gets more complex. We're trying to change this perception of risk to benefits. So how do you quantify social, economic, and environmental benefits of water at a bigger scale? And climate change for us is huge. And in fact, it's actually great for us in the water sector. We're working very, very hard to make the climate change story not so much on mitigation, but adaptation. And we were just talking also in EIB that we're also trying to look at resilience ratings, and we always want to put in a climate change story because then it's much easier for us to finance our projects, and also it's good. The final point that always perplexes me is we say in water, a lot of times there's a lot more willingness to pay for water from communities, but much more reluctance of willingness to charge by politicians. And I'm always wondering, is that the same thing with the willingness to borrow or to invest capital? I don't understand if government officials understand the big risk. And I think that's why we need to work with GWP and other types of organizations with data and information and bring in the social awareness, the social accountability. to really ask governments to invest into this long-term look at how we're going to look and manage water resources.
Yes, Jennifer. Yes, go ahead, Joseph.
I come from the private sector, so normally, as an entrepreneur, our objective always is solutions. We started a company in the year 2006. We currently are managing 55,000 workforce into the waste management sector. There was an issue with wastewater, which was trying to pollute the sea. In Ghana, I come from Ghana. In Ghana, we were having all the wastewater being discharged directly into the sea untreated. I was looking for financing. At that time, the World Bank has given Ghana, from 2011 to 2014, more than 1 billion Ghana cedis. And as Jennifer was saying, the World Bank's instrument always goes to government. As a private individual, with the objective of solutions, what I did was to go to the manufacturers. Can you give me your equipment? And today, technology have been advanced. You have technology, you don't have solutions for it. I have a problem, I need your technology. We just partnered to it, and we're able to solve a 100-year problem of wastewater being discharged into the sea, and it is solved now. So we were able to protect more of polluted water that goes out and other situations. What we did again was we were having one of the biggest lake, let's say waterway that flows into the sea. It was not dredged for more than 20, 30 years. We went into Finland, credit on our own balance sheet, brought it in, and were able to just dredge. And when it rains, in the year 2015, there was a serious water flood that kills 200 lives. 200 lives were lost in Ghana. We were able to dredge, and since 2015 to date, it has been heavy raining, but no losses. What I'm driving at is that we are leaders of this generation. There are solutions. We must find innovative ways to solve it. Being rational or irrational, there are solutions. Let's find it out, and we can solve it out.
Great, great. Monique?
I just wanted to add something to that specific question that you made. Is the financial sector driving us in the right direction rather than the other way around? And I think what we all understand, and quite frankly, I don't know that we are representing anyone here is really representing the financial sector. You're from a productive side, you're not, right? And, public sector, finance, etc. But I think it is still a really good question, because the financial sector is as good as bad as a society constructs it. And the financial sector will send the right or the wrong signal, will be more short-termistic or less short-termistic, depending on what society requires the financial sector to do. And what I find really interesting is that in the climate change context, we now have a number of central banks that are regulating the risk exposure of the banks in their countries that relates to climate risk. Can that happen in the context of water risk? Do we have the instruments for your firm, when you go to a bank and ask for a credit, for that bank to understand how water risk exposed you are? Today, the banks don't have that. Today, I don't know of any central bank that would require that. And I mean, talking with the Carbon Disclosure Project people, the CDP, who are starting to develop such mechanisms, if only for the large funds, to understand where they want to put their money in. It's a more complex matter. It's seemingly solvable, but it hasn't been done yet. So if we're looking at that kind of instruments on the banking side, it does require a shift in the data and analysis that you would do, because you would need to show the bank how exposed you are, right? And so there's a ways to go. I think the insurance sector there is further, but it does require further conversations with regulators and with central banks for that matter.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, Joseph, and then Karen. You want to go ahead, Kieran? Or?
Yeah, maybe following what Monica just said, I think there's also a huge responsibility for the public banks on this. And for example, in our case, we do a lot of what we call intermediated lending, meaning that we lend to commercial banks, which then on lend to SMEs or to public and private operators in the ground. And I think this is part of our responsibility to ensure that this climate risk assessment that I mentioned earlier, we give the tools as well, or we train or we educate the commercial banks to be able to assess this risk when they later on lend to in the ground. This is part of our responsibility, I think.
Mm-hmm. Karen, yes?
I sometimes think we overcomplicate these things. A bank and the finance, not the development banks, but a bank and the finance sector is a very, very simple organism. It exists to make a profit. I mean, so waiting around for a bank to develop climate enlightenment, you're going to be waiting quite a long time. So what a bank needs is regulatory certainty. It needs to know. So if you know by domestic regulation, by European Commission regulation, by whatever system, that this externality has now to be taken into account in pricing, that this change in the environment is going to happen over the next year, all of a sudden that becomes bankable. And this is what they do. Look at a reinsurance company website. The reinsurance companies are quite extraordinary in terms of looking 12, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. And if you look at what an reinsurance company is looking at and looking at legislation coming down the tracks, that's actually where you can make a project that is bankable. Outside that, a bank is not a decent, nice person. A bank is a simple organism to make money.
Perfect. We have a few minutes, so we'd like to open to the public if there's anybody who would like to pose a question or bring up an issue. Very short. Please, you can get the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Colley. I work with the Josbo Group of Companies, and I'm also studying for my PhD at the University of Ghana. I would like to ask the financiers, looking to the future, how do you put it side by side investment in the area of climate protection, say planting of trees, doing awareness and watershed protection, as against just financing climate resilience projects, so that when there's flooding or there's climate change, it wouldn't affect the project? So how would you like to project into the future, whether there's funding for climate change mitigation in the area of water protection, or just building strong structures that will withstand climate change when there's flooding also? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take another question up in the floor, and then we'll answer. Yes. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Lawrence Tete. I studied at Governors Economic University here in Budapest. So I had a chance to be trained here in Budapest before going back to Ghana. My contribution is that I think the commentators seem not to give us words that will disseminate the information to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Water is killing a lot of people. And sometimes we tend to use jargons much more than technologies that people can comment. I'm looking at the topic here today. What is the economically rational behavior? It sounds very good, but for the ordinary man, how does he break it down? I'm looking at it as a PhD holder, so maybe I can analyze this, but that will mean a whole dissertation. But how can the ordinary man here, who has not been to school before, in the village in Togo, in the village in Ghana, in the village in, let's say, Ouagadougou, explain this? Water is killing us. Bad water, good water. And as a matter of fact, the fact that we have a community here that can deal with it, let us learn. So my contribution is that the commentators, and of course those who have the ability to read and write about water, should not let it become too strong a language, but they should break it down to that level where every man in every society can understand what the risk of water and lack of water can be to our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two questions. We will have one person in the panel answer one and the other another because of the time. Who would like to take the first one? Want to do it, Jennifer? Go ahead.
I'm actually going to combine the two answers, if that's okay. I mean, I think the question is, do you want to invest in climate awareness or climate resilience? And I would just say climate awareness is very much part of climate resilience. We're not going to build our way out of this problem in any way at all. And what we really need is awareness, and we need behavior change, and that comes through your second question. I fully agree that we need language that people can understand, but more importantly, we need to understand people, because many people know how to adapt already. They know how to use nature-based solutions. I think the Honorable Minister from Ghana this morning gave us examples about that as well. And we can find very many cultural relevant ways to understand and about adaptation and resilience. You know, a lot of things like early warning systems. You can build anything you want, but if you don't have a way to communicate with people, it's not going to work. So I agree with both of those points. Thanks.
Okay, another answer from the panel. Frick, and then you will go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, very briefly, building on what you said, that was the point in my introduction, what I meant, that it's so complex a problem that you do not only need all of the government, you need all of society. And we are actually investing a lot of energy and time and building partnerships so that the national climate plans are really based on the local communities. And starting last year in our conference, the Climate Summit, the annual one, there is an indigenous platform. So we get the voices of indigenous people in. There are least developed country experts that are meeting and are being supported by us so they can spread the word in their languages, in the villages, and really get from the bottom up the energy, because the best plans will never work if they are not anchored in the local communities.
Thank you very much. We have been very good with the timekeeping, so we'll have two more answers. Go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you very much. On the issue of the bank aspect that the gentleman asked, that's my brother. I will humbly suggest to the bank to create innovative ways of dealing with the issue of this water issue. World Bank supports countries a lot, Africa and the whole world, and mostly the funds by their regulatory is targeted towards government. Now, you need government will and political will to be able to deal with the issue of water crisis. And so when you want the involvement of the private sector, and certain instruments can be tilted to help, the private sector have the technology, have the will, have the workforce, have the innovation, the creativity to deal with this issue. Government alone have been struggling over the years, and that have become more challenging. I'm humbly appealing to the bank to create innovative ways. In Hungary here, what Exim Bank have done very useful, of which I want to commend them, is that they have found a way of how best we, the private sector, can be having some support. And as I speak now, Perico Hungary and Just Born have received 30 million euros in true equipment financing. And through equipment financing, we are able to deal with wastewater in Ghana. So it shows that we are constructing 3 wastewater treatment plants to deal with issues where this wastewater were polluting rivers and other things. So it's solving the water pollution issue. So the bank should create other instruments of equipment financing and other ways of supporting the private sector. And I think this water crisis can be solved.
1 short minute, Monica.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the point that the gentleman had made about the language. And it's an important one, and it's not just that the diplomat may be afraid of the hydrologist is also afraid of the diplomat. And I was very struck in the Global Water Partnership. We've worked for the last 8-9 years on a larger program on climate and water development. And we've just pulled out the results. And one of the stories that struck most with me was a very large program run by the government of Thailand at the time on flood management in the Northwest, and where there were massive issues around getting communities engaged. And once the group started consulting with the communities, there was, and forgive the pun, a watershed of improvements in that nobody had realized that all the instructions were written on a piece of paper that was in a place where the community had to travel an hour and a half in order to even find out what it said there. Nobody was listening to them. And communities often understand water management much better than somebody who sits in the capital, whether it's drought management or flood management. They also understand where to invest and what not to do. What they need is people to help them with the larger investments and to listen to them. So very much that point on listening, but not just in order to make understood what the community should do, but also to learn what the community knows about flood management and can do much better, so that that influences the flood management plans or the drought management plans, or more generally the work to address crises in various places.
Well, thank you very much. Trying to summarize in a few words what we have discussed today, we have seen that there are ample examples, positive examples of what we could call rational behavior from the various stakeholders, whether we're from the financial sector, from the water sector, and from the environmental sector as a whole. However, we have identified that there is still a long path to go, and we still need to come together maybe more often. And these questions need to be further debated to really interact in a holistic way and to try to address the issues related to the water crisis, today's and those that we anticipate might come. But I would like to close this session by congratulating, first of all, and thanking the members of the panels for their insight and for sharing their experiences with us. So thank you very much. And also the audience for being patient and giving us the opportunity to address these themes, which I will now convey and confess to you. As a moderator, it took me several months to understand how are we going to answer that questions. And we had a lot of discussions back and forth. What does it really mean? What should we do? So I hope that we have not completely illustrated this, but created enough interest, creating enough, sense of we need to get more into this. We need to be able to address that question. So I hope that in the next water summit here in the Budapest, or wherever the Hungarian government decides to hold its next one, and I hope they do decide to have a second one, we will have more answers and more clarity for those of you and for us. We'd like to take the opportunity on behalf of all the members of the panels to congratulate the government and the people of Hungary for this wonderful event and the platform that it has provided us for share the knowledge, but most important, to share our interactions with you, and to say thank you for your hospitality and wish all of you a real good, successful rest of the event. So good evening, and we hope to see you at the gala.
Thank you very much, Maria. And to summarize the first day, I definitely can say that the first output that I can pass on to the organizers is there is a need of another summit, I hear. So we have come to the end of the first day. I would like to thank all our panelists and participants for attending the summit so far. Please allow me to tell you just a little bit more about tonight. The cultural event hosted by President Ader will take place at the Palace of Arts. Organized buses will take you there. They will leave from the street to the right. You can access the Kis Rókus utca from the glass alley that leads to the building D. There will also buses taking you back to different locations in the city. We will tell you further about that at the event place. So please make your way slowly to the buses as they will be leaving as soon as possible. Thank you for your participation once again. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.